Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. Dr. Oliver Sacks was a neurologist, an author, a traveler, a music lover, and a botanist. He was also an amazing communicator. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
On February 22, 1997, Dr. Oliver Sacks came into our studio with a wet bathing suit in one hand and a cycad plant in the other. He was there to talk about his book, The Island of the Colorblind.
Dr. Sacks died on August 30th. To honor his memory, we share this conversation about one of his lesser-known books.
We talk about his trip to Micronesia. How does the environment affect neurological function?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, a rebroadcast of our 1997 interview with Dr. Oliver Sacks.
First, the news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, new research confirms your grandmother was right. Getting enough sleep keeps your immune system in good working order. The study included 164 healthy young men and women who kept track of their sleep every night for a week using diaries and devices. Then they were deliberately exposed to a standard quantity of cold virus, which was sprayed into their noses.
After the exposure, the volunteers were quarantined and monitored to see if they started sniffling, sneezing, and coughing within 5 days. 45% of those who averaged less than 5 hours of sleep nightly came down with cold symptoms, compared to just 17% of those who slept at least 7 hours most nights. The authors point out that previous research has shown immune system impairment in people who are sleep deprived. They did not study immune system activity in these volunteers, nor does anyone know whether interventions to improve sleep, such as medication or cognitive behavioral therapy, would boost immune defenses against infection.
The FDA has just issued a warning about a serious complication of certain popular diabetes drugs. Gliptins, known as DPP-4 inhibitors, include medications like Januvia and Onglyza. Januvia was approved by the FDA in 2006, and Onglyza reached pharmacy shelves in 2009. Now, after several years, the agency has determined that these and similar drugs can cause severe and potentially disabling joint pain. The pain may begin within a few days of starting the medicine, but some people report that it can take years to show up. In most cases, it goes away within a month of stopping the medication. The FDA encourages people to report any joint pain to their prescribers promptly.
Persistent joint pain sometimes leads people to sign up for a hip or knee replacement. A new study of around 20,000 people who went through replacement surgery has found that the chance of a heart attack is higher in the month following the surgery. Those who had a knee replacement had 8 times the heart attack risk in that first post-surgical month, while for those whose hips were replaced, the risk was 4 times higher. The increased risk of a heart attack did not last much beyond the first month after the surgery, but a risk of blood clots lasted for several years after the surgery was done. These can also be extremely dangerous if they break loose and lodge in the lungs or the brain.
Low levels of vitamin D may contribute to the chance of developing age-related macular degeneration, but only in people with genetic susceptibility. Scientists at the University of Buffalo analyzed data on more than 1,200 women in a section of the Women's Health Initiative. This part of the study is considering nutritional status and the risk of macular degeneration. Serum levels were assessed as 25-hydroxyvitamin D, which is a marker of vitamin D from all sources. The likelihood of macular degeneration was strongest in women with a specific variant of an immune system gene called CFH, who also had low levels of 25-hydroxyvitamin D.
Overweight or obese men with prostate cancer may benefit from 2 surprising medications. These are old drugs that are well known, but not for treating prostate cancer. Aspirin was introduced as a pain reliever and fever reducer at the end of the 19th century. It's been popular ever since. Metformin, derived from the French lilac plant, has been prescribed for patients with type 2 diabetes since 1958. The botanical medicine Galega officinalis, from which it was derived, was used to treat symptoms like diabetes during the 17th century. Now, researchers at Rutgers Cancer Institute of New Jersey are combining aspirin and metformin in a clinical trial to determine whether these two drugs can block the development of prostate cancer. Epidemiology has shown that metformin and aspirin each seems to have anti-inflammatory and anti-cancer activity. Combining the two might be even more powerful. Understanding the molecular mechanisms of action of these medicines leads scientists to believe that they may be able to prevent the development or recurrence of prostate cancer. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Dr. Oliver Sacks has left an indelible mark on our culture. Dr. Sacks was far more than a neurologist. He was also a brilliant author whose books about the human condition enlightened and inspired us. He showed us how to look at people with neurological differences and recognize their special gifts and their humanity.
Oliver Sacks died on August 30th. In his February essay for the New York Times titled My Own Life, he wrote, "There will be no one like us when we're gone, but then there is no one like anyone else ever. When people die, they cannot be replaced. They leave holes that cannot be filled, for it's the fate, the genetic and neural fate, of every human being to be a unique individual, to find his own path, to live his own life, to die his own death." To honor his memory, we're bringing to you today an interview we did with Dr. Sacks in February 1997. He was discussing his book, The Island of the Colorblind.
Today we have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Oliver Sacks. Dr. Sacks, welcome to the People's Pharmacy.
It's nice to be here.
You are, without doubt, the world's most famous neurologist. What does that feel like?
Well, I'm sure I'm not, and if I am, I don't have much consciousness of it. I'm the same person as I always was, sort of a little shy and stubborn, and I still see patients in the hospitals I've worked for 30 years or more, but it may give me a certain freedom, including when I want, and what I talk about in the latest book, the freedom to go to Micronesia and see some islands where there were some remarkable new diseases.
Actually, you call yourself a neuroanthropologist, and that rings true for us because...
Well, how can I fail to be charmed by a person who writes a book with the title An Anthropologist on Mars and who considers himself a neuroanthropologist? Because, after all, I'm a medical anthropologist. And I did find your book, The Island of the Colorblind, fascinating.
But what is a neuroanthropologist, Dr. Sacks?
Well, I didn't invent the term, and really I shouldn't use the term, but I suppose it would apply to someone who's concerned with the meaning of illness, especially neurological illness or injury to the individual, and how it is regarded in the community, and perhaps any special roles, social or cultural roles, which may fall upon people with particular neurological disorders.
And is that what you were looking for when you went to Micronesia?
Basically so. I don't know how irrelevant I'm allowed to be, but
As irrelevant as you wish.
The sky's the limit.
Okay. But when I was a boy, I read an H.G. Wells story called The Country of the Blind. And this relates the story of a traveller lost in South America who blunders into an isolated valley. He's sort of puzzled by the party-coloured houses that he sees, and he thinks these people must have been as blind as bats. And he finds, in fact, that this is a community of blind people, blind from a disease which occurred 3 or more centuries before, and that they have no cultural memory of seeing a vision and no concept. And first he regards them as very defective and thinks he can take over, but then the roles get reversed and he finds they are beautifully adapted, and he is the fumbling, stumbling dement, and they regard him as in fact disabled by these mobile pathologies in the face, which he calls eyes. And when he falls in love with a girl from the village and wants to stay, they say he can, provided he will have them removed. But this is a sort of, if you want, a sort of an imaginary anthropological study of a blind community. And this was somewhat in my mind when I heard of this island in Micronesia where there was a very high proportion of people who were totally colorblind and had no concept of color.
Of course, even a high proportion of people who are colorblind is not a majority of the people on this island, is it?
No, it's not a majority, but I thought even so it might have an effect. I especially thought here of Martha's Vineyard, where in the last century, in some of the up island villages, 1 person in 4 was born congenitally deaf, and in fact the whole island responded to this by acquiring sign language as a first language. I mean, so much so that deaf people often were not recognized as being any different. The whole sort of, there was not only no stigma, sometimes no recognition. I encountered a somewhat similar situation in a little village, a Mennonite community in Canada, where I went with a good friend of mine, Lowell Handler. Lowell Handler himself has Tourette's, and Tourette's maybe only has an incidence of 1 in 1,000 or something in the general population, and he had always felt somewhat isolated and sometimes stigmatized. And when we got up to this village, he was at first on his best behavior, and then suddenly he let out a loud, irrepressible, Tourettic yelp. And everyone looked at him, but then everyone smiled, and many yelped back, and he realized that he was, as it were, among his brethren. And the incidence of Tourette's in this community is about 1 in 4, 1 in 5. Tourette's is often not recognized because everyone, well, not everyone, but so many people sort of yelp and tick that it's almost part of the norm. It's okay. It's socially okay. In a way a little reminiscent of the Wells story, Lowell had a fantasy that he might meet a nice Mennonite girl with Tourette's and stay there and live happily ever after. But of course he was sent out into the wide world outside.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Sachs. You had migraines as a child.
I still do.
And the visual disturbances associated with migraines were perhaps a little reminiscent of being colorblind. Did this stimulate some of your interest in this area?
Well, one can have all sorts of disturbances in visual migraines. Loss of colour or distortion of colour in part of the visual field, or sometimes the whole field, and sometimes half the visual field itself will disappear. I think that having these migraines as a child, they were very terrifying at first, but I think this was one of the things which showed me that we're not just given the world, but it has to be created for us by our organs and by the brain. And I think was one of the things which stirred my interest in neurology in particular, and in the perception of colour and colour blindness in particular.
I wonder if we could explore that a little bit further, this idea of not being just given the world. I mean, it's not just there and we sort of suck it in like a sponge and there it is. How do we know that?
You know, the Isherwood's Berlin stories start with, I am a camera recording passively, but of course, and there's a certain tendency to compare us to cameras and films or microphones. One of the striking things which show that even though we may get a unified picture, this depends on a whole multitude of complex processes in the brain, is to see people, patients, who have lost a particular aspect of visual perception. In an earlier book, I spoke of an artist who had normal colour vision for his first 60 years, but then had some brain damage to two small areas in the visual cortex, which knocked out the sense of colour entirely, and in his case not only knocked out colour perception, but the ability to imagine or remember or dream colour. The brain couldn't construct colour. Next to that area, there's another area which is needed to construct the sense of movement. There's a fascinating, unique patient in Germany, a young woman who had a stroke affecting these areas, and she only sees stills. She sees people and cars perfectly well until they move, and then they vanish, but may reappear as stills. And, one thinks we're given a world full of colour and movement, but the colour and movement have to be constructed or reconstructed by the brain.
How did it affect this artist? I can only imagine that an artist whose life would be so tied up with probably with color, with form, would be devastated if he suddenly were unable to perceive or even imagine color.
Well, absolutely, and he was sort of eminent for his use of colour. It was most crucial and precious for him in his art, and generally for his sensibility and feeling for the world and his ways of organising himself. And he felt it was the end of him as an artist and the end of him generally. He felt quite suicidal. And he also described the world without colour as impoverished, ugly, incoherent, and there was a terrible period. Then, very interestingly, I think a deep reconstruction started. And the black and white world, which had seemed so difficult to cope with and so ugly, started to become coherent and beautiful for him and to re-inspire art. And I think his appreciation of other qualities of luminosity and texture, shape, boundary, depth, movement were heightened. And fascinatingly, 3 years after his injury, when there'd been no recovery, when we had a thought that it might be possible to return some colour perception to him, he said no, he wasn't interested.
You're listening to Dr. Oliver Sacks. We're honoring his memory today by running an interview he recorded with us in February of 1997.
It's time for a short break. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion with Dr. Sacks. He tells us about the island of the colorblind and about Knut, a colorblind scientist who accompanied Dr. Sacks on this trip. How did he relate to the islanders?
We get a few hints on how culture and our expectations shape our perceptions.
How do colorblind people choose a ripe banana if they can't see the difference between yellow and green?
We also learn about a neurological disease unique to the island of Guam. What might it teach us about ALS?
Dr. Sacks helps us reflect on why neurological diseases frighten us so much.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like the information you hear when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, you may also enjoy our book published by National Geographic. It's The People's Pharmacy Quick and Handy Home Remedies, available online at peoplespharmacy.com or at your favorite bookstore.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you would like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 162. That number again, 800-732-2334, or find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today we're honoring the memory of Dr. Oliver Sacks. On February 22, 1997, he came into our studios on the campus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill holding a wet bathing suit in one hand and a cycad plant in the other. Dr. Sacks was an avid swimmer and had just completed his laps. He draped his Speedo trunks over a microphone stand and placed the plant on our recording table. Then we talked about his trip to Micronesia and the book he had just written about it, The Island of the Colorblind.
The obituaries and eulogies for Oliver Sacks have mentioned his better-known books, such as Awakenings, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and An Anthropologist on Mars. We loved talking with him in 1997 about the Island of the Colorblind, and we hope you find our discussion intriguing.
Oliver, I guess the thing that was so fascinating to me in reading about the Island of the Colorblind was that you took along with you a Norwegian physician, Knut, and Knut was colorblind. And when he got to the island, they related to him and he related to them a little bit the way Lowell Handler related to the people with Tourette's in Canada. Tell us about it.
Well, absolutely. These totally colorblind people who can only see in black and white, these achromatopes have no cones in the eye, which means they have some other difficulties, which in fact are very much more incapacitating than the color blindness. They only have rods, and we all have rods for night vision, and they have superb night vision, but they get dazzled by the daylight. And Knut himself has to wear several pairs of dark glasses and tends to squint and reduce daylight. Anyhow, when we arrived on this little island, there's a tiny landing strip. It was a rather dramatic and very nearly a terminal arrival because there was a sudden tailwind and we practically ended in the lagoon. But when we got out, there were sounds of laughter, and there was the most wonderful spectacle of children coming out of the forest. For a moment I thought Pingelap, this little coral atoll, was an island of children. I, at that point, didn't see anything else, but then Knut immediately saw that some of the children were squinting or blinking, that two of them had black, dark cloths over their head, and he instantly saw these were his fellow achromatopes, as they, seeing him squinting and dark-glassed getting off the plane, realized that he was one of them. And as you say, it was just like Lowell and Lacrete. And there was a sort of sense of kinship and affinity between Knut and the achromatopes, I think, which was deeper than the cultural differences. And this lent a whole new dimension to our visit.
One of the things that we anthropologists are especially interested in is how culture shapes the meanings that we are able to gather or to put on the perceptions that we get from the world. As you were talking earlier about the fact that our brains have to organize these perceptions for us to be able to understand them, to make any meaning out of them. But anthropologists also think that culture organizes the way that people understand their experience. How did you see that at work, or did you see that at work on the island of Pingelap, where so many of these people did have the inability to see color?
Well, first, you should have been there in my place. One should have had a real anthropologist, and I think someone who stayed for a year and was adopted by a family and became intimate with the culture and the language. And none of this was true for me, so I only have a few brief impressions. In no particular order, I was struck by the mythologies, by the many myths which were present on the island regarding the origin and, if you want, the meaning of the maskun, which means not see in Pingelapese. Some myths have a nocturnal god coming down as an incubus and sleeping with the island women and having a day-blind a nocturnal changeling as children. Other myths relate this to pregnant women walking on the beach in the bright sunlight and perhaps having their children partly blinded. A fascinating myth took form, or took intensified form, when Knut himself came, because here for the first time they saw a white man, a European, with their own disease, and they'd always suspected that the disease came from the outside, and this was it. And the myth developed within 3 days that it had been achromatopic white whalers from the far north, from Norway, coming to the island in the 1820s, who in fact had raped the island women and had generated the achromatopes. And by this notion, the Pingelapes are partly Norwegian. And
I'm sure that Norway would be quite surprised to learn that.
Right. Well, certainly Knut himself was amused, astonished, awed, slightly frightened by the speed with which this developed. But there is certainly some tendency for social roles for the achromatopes on the island. It's difficult. We took 200 pairs of sunglasses with us, and this may in fact alter some of the culture a little bit. I don't know whether we should have done so. A real anthropologist wouldn't have done so. But, we wanted to give some return for coming there and questioning them and seeing them and exploiting them. But it was certain jobs are done, and done superbly well, and in a peculiarly good fashion by the achromatopes. Fishing is crucially important, night fishing, sometimes by the light of the full moon, sometimes using torches or flashlights. The achromatopes, with their night vision, are better able to see fish in their dim course underwater, or the moonlight on the outstretched fins of fish. They can see this better than the normals. So the night fishing of Pingelap is done by achromatopes and has been done for a century. There's also a peculiar sort of achromatopic art, which we saw. There are weavers who make very beautiful mats containing images which are not visible to normal people in ordinary daylight, because they're done in dim mauves and purples which have no colour contrast, but there is a luminosity or brightness contrast, and as daylight falls and dusk comes and all of us use our rods, these mats come alive, and the patterns and the images sort of start to shine out. Only an achromatope could make mats like this.
Oliver, one of the stories that you relate in The Island of the Colorblind is when Knut shares with a family his monocular and says, "I've given away
half my
eye."
Yeah. Yet another problem with having no central vision and no cones is one's visual acuity is only about 1/10 of normal, and so Knut dealt with this by using a magnifying glass for reading and a monocular, like a tiny little telescope, for distant vision. And at one point he was talking to an islander, actually a preacher on the island, who was there with his colour-normal wife, although no doubt she was a carrier of the gene, and his 3 achromatopic children. And such a feeling of brotherliness and fraternity between them. And at one point Knut took this monocular, which is always hanging round his neck because it's crucial. He took it and he gave it to this man. He gave it to Entis. And Entis put it to his eye, and for the first time he could see boats in the sea and distant vegetation, and he focused down and he could see the details of his own, the whorls on his fingers, and a radiant smile appeared on his face from one ear to another. And he couldn't speak, but his wife went in and she gave Knut a necklace of cowrie shells, which was the most precious thing they had. Certainly for Knut it was most precious. He said, "I've given half my eye to him."
Certainly, but he realized that when he returned to Norway, Knut would be able to get another one, and then would be able to do the distant seeing that he needed to do, whereas Entis, the Pingelapese preacher, did not have a good way to get another one?
No, we were sort of... there were really almost no optical aids, not even sunglasses on the island. We took 200 pairs of sunglasses. We also had a cargo of monoculars and magnifying glasses, which maddeningly, I haven't mentioned this in the book, but it got lost at Los Angeles Airport.
I wondered about that.
That would be maddening.
There was one older woman who refused the sunglasses.
Yeah, she was a woman of about 80. I think she was the oldest achromatope on the island. She says, I'm fine. I've lived like this for 80 years. I'm not going to wear these silly things. And I don't have sufficient follow-up as to how much these silly things, in fact, have been acceptable. Certainly some of the teenage kids love them. They could see much better, but also they look cute.
Right.
Tell me about the banana. What a wonderful metaphor.
When we arrived on the island, our guide is a man called James, an achromatope. We were still a little contemptuous. There were three of us. There was Knut, and there was Bob Wasserman, an ophthalmologist friend of mine. And Bob and I still sort of thought these people must be disabled. And rather contemptuously, we said to James, how can you people tell when a banana's ripe? You can't even see the difference between green and yellow. And James didn't say anything, but there was a little smile, and he went... There are many, many sorts of bananas on the island, and he went and he came back with a carefully selected bright green banana. And we were about to say, look, you've shown how incompetent you are. And he said, try it. And it was ripe and delicious. And he said, you see, you would have missed it. You just go by colour. We go by texture, feel, smell. And suddenly this was a little bit like the Wells story. We felt we were the incompetent ones.
I think it's time to move on from the island of the colorblind to Guam.
Before we talk about Guam, though, I have a question for you, Oliver. People can have a range of health problems. A heart attack, high blood pressure, asthma, acne, and we don't get too excited about it. We don't get too upset. When you hear that Uncle Charlie had a heart attack, everybody goes, okay, how's he doing? When people have a neurological condition, whether it be Tourette's or autism, or perhaps a psychiatric condition like schizophrenia, or a neurological condition like Parkinson's disease, it seems like our consciousness has a harder time dealing with that. There is almost not a revulsion so much, but it scares people. Have you thought about this, and do you have any thoughts or comments you'd like to share?
Well, I think it probably scares people to the extent that the brain and the nervous system are so much more central to one's identity and one's way of functioning in the world. You may have heart failure or asthma or acne, but you're still the same person and with perhaps some limitations. Whereas certainly some neurological disorders start to alter one's world or oneself or the way one moves in the world. Some neurological disorders are very public and can sort of instantly catch attention.
Like Tourette's?
Like Tourette's, which one can sort of the first time... after seeing a patient with Tourette's for the first time, I saw 3 people with Tourette's in the streets of New York the following day. I think I'd probably seen them and not seen them for years, but certainly this is very visible and audible and tangible. But there are some neurological illnesses, I think, which alter identity or meaning or experience and take one into unfamiliar and sometimes uncanny territory.
Well, it seems as though it might be frightening for the rest of us to imagine not having the experience that we are so comfortable with.
Yes, I mean, for example, we take speech for granted.
Mm-hmm.
it seems as natural as breathing. Language is acquired almost automatically in the third year of life. Speech is part of the intercourse of being human. And to be aphasic and lose language is peculiarly horrifying. There is a shocking quality about it, and I think everyone feels this. I think this, I think this was also very well brought out in a play called Wings, which is partly about it.
And of course, Awakenings was in part about the inability for people to communicate. And we recently visited with my cousin, who is at the end stages of ALS, and she can no longer speak. She can no longer move. Her eyes move about 1/4 of an inch. And it was extraordinarily painful for us to try and communicate with her and not be able to receive messages back.
You're listening to Dr. Oliver Sacks. Our interview was recorded in February 1997. Dr. Sacks died on August 30th, and in his passing leaves a huge hole. He brought enormous curiosity to his investigation of the natural world and, of course, to the function and failures of human neurological systems. His communication skills were phenomenal, and he wrote in the same clear and elegant style that you're hearing on the air today.
His books include The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, Awakenings, Musicophilia, Hallucinations, The Mind's Eye, An Anthropologist on Mars, Uncle Tungsten, Seeing Voices, Migraine, Oaxaca Journal, A Leg to Stand On, A Glorious Accident, On the Move, and The Island of the Colorblind.
Dr. Sacks was a brilliant neurologist and an empathetic healer. He wrote thought-provoking essays for the New York Times, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and many other publications. His article entitled Sabbath was published in the New York Times 2 weeks before his death. He ends by writing, "And now, weak, short of breath, my once firm muscles melted away by cancer, I find my thoughts increasingly not on the supernatural or spiritual, but on what is meant by living a good and worthwhile life, achieving a sense of peace within oneself. I find my thoughts drifting to the Sabbath, the day of rest, the 7th day of the week, and perhaps the 7th day of one's life as well, when one can feel that one's work is done and one may, in good conscience, rest."
We need to take a short break. Coming up, we'll learn about the disease on Guam. How is it similar to ALS?
What exactly is ALS, and what's going on in Guam?
Are the psychads on Guam responsible for this neurological condition in any way?
We discuss the significance of aluminum and whether it might be relevant to the development of Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease.
Dr. Sacks shares his passions of botany and horticulture and the wealth of experience he had traveling in Micronesia.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339. Online at uttercream.com.
To order a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 162. That number again, 800-732-2334. Online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today we are honoring the memory of Dr. Oliver Sacks. He died on August 30th. But his legacy lives on through his books, articles, and interviews. Today we're airing a conversation we had with him on February 22nd, 1997. The topic was his recently published book, The Island of the Colorblind.
Tell us about Guam, because that is where there is a condition very similar to what we call ALS.
Right. Well, when Navy physicians got to Guam in 1945, they found an ALS-like condition there, which in some areas was almost 1,000 times commoner than in the States. This is a pretty rare disease.
You better tell us what ALS is all about.
ALS is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, sometimes called Lou Gehrig's disease because he had it, sometimes called Stephen Hawking disease because he has it, or motor neuron disease in England. In this disease, the motor cells of the spinal cord and the lower parts of the brain degenerate. The muscles lose their power, and sometimes it becomes spastic, while the intellect and the senses remain exactly the same. So the person becomes, in a way, a helpless observer of his own deterioration. Finally, the muscles of speech and of swallowing are involved, and basically the person chokes to death. It is a horrible disease, and one which makes even neurologists very uncomfortable.
And the mind, the intellect, remains intact.
The intellect remains absolutely intact, and so you have someone like Stephen Hawking, who is an amazing genius.
And just trapped there inside a body that won't do what you want it or need to have it do.
Yeah, absolutely. This, can be profoundly frustrating.
So, well, tell us then about Guam. This disease that is similar to ALS on Guam then is 1,000 times more common there than ALS is here. What is going on?
Well, there is... one tends to have often endemic diseases on islands, as you can have endemic plants and animals. The isolation and perhaps the intermarriage in a human culture tends to lead to this. On Guam, there's this disease which the native people, the Chamorros, call litico-bodig. Litico is short for paralytico and refers to the paralytic ALS-like form which the disease can sometimes take. It can also take a form somewhat like that of Parkinson's disease, a little like that of Alzheimer's disease, considerably like that of my post-encephalitic, my awakenings patients. This disease has existed on Guam for about 200 years, as the achromatopia has existed on Pingalap for about 2 centuries. But whereas the achromatopia on Pingalap is a simple autosomal recessive, as they say, is genetic, is a recessive, requires 2 carriers to meet, occurs equally in both sexes, and occurs in Pingalap because there was a disaster in the 1770s which almost exterminated the population, and the population was then built up from an affected person, or person with the gene, and some of his relatives. But the disease in Guam does not have a simple genetic pattern like this. And so people have wondered for years what else may it be due to. This is a terrible disease on Guam. It's fatal whatever form it takes. And at one time it accounted for 1/10 of adult deaths among the Chamorros all over the island, and in some villages 1/3 of the deaths. And it's been going on at least since 1800, although it may have risen to a peak in the 1930s and the 1940s. It looks as if no one contracted the disease after about 1950 or 55, though at that time one would even see teenagers who have it, and now only people in their 60s and 70s who probably contracted the disease 30 or 40 years ago, but are only becoming ill now. So this is a very strange disease.
It sounds very strange because it sounds as though you've got whatever it is can take a very long time to show up.
Right.
And yet whatever it is appears to have disappeared around, 1950, 1955.
A medical mystery.
Do we have some idea of what that might have been?
Well, there have been many thoughts. When it was clear that this wasn't a simple genetic disease, people said, is there something special about the soil, the food, the way of life? And attention got focused by an anthropologist, nutritionist team, Marjorie Whiting and her husband, on cycads. Cycads are primitive trees which grow in tropical and subtropical areas.
Now, is this a cycad that you brought along?
Yes, well, I went out cycad hunting just before I came here, and this is a cycad. This actually is a Japanese cycad. I couldn't, on the spur of the moment, get a Guam cycad.
Describe the Japanese cycad you have in our studio.
Well, it's a small specimen of a somewhat, superficially, a somewhat palm-like plant. Indeed, this is called the sago palm, but it's not a palm, and it has long, dark green fronds which are quite stiff and sharp to the touch. I can't tell whether this is a male or a female plant. You can't tell until the reproductive organs appear, and the male cycas has a huge cone. In some species it may weigh 30 or 40 pounds, and the female doesn't. Male and female plants usually grow in proximity.
Oh, they would need to, I should think, yes. Unless, of course, you have some helpful birds or insects.
Well, you do have helpful insects, and interestingly, one thinks that insects and smells came in with flowering plants, but they came in much earlier with cycads, and the first insect plant pollination and the symbiotic systems came in really right at the end of the Paleozoic. These are very ancient plants. They go back 300 million years.
Now, what does this beautiful green frond-like plant have to do with an ALS-like condition?
Right. Well, in the female plant, when the seeds are fertilized, you get large, rather beautiful plum-like seeds, which are orange or yellow. And inside the seeds, there's a very nutritious sago-like substance. Now, many, many cultures have discovered how nutritious cycads are, but they also know how poisonous they are. And the seeds, every culture has found ways of detoxifying the seeds. They either need to be soaked and re-soaked, often 10 or 12 times, or fermented. And there are many cultures who eat cycads and love them and have not got ill. Now, the question is, if it is otherwise with the Chamorros, if the cycad is playing a part, is there something special about their cycad? Is there something special about them? Or is there some defect in the processing? Now, cycad eating was common at a time when the disease was at its worst. Since the Second World War, nutrition has changed all over the Pacific, for better or worse. I think mostly for worse, but certainly with the importing of rice and wheat, cycad eating has declined greatly, and so has the disease.
You're listening to Dr. Oliver Sacks. He is sharing with us his experience in Micronesia. He visited a number of islands, one Pingalap, where they have a high incidence of color blindness, the other Guam, where they have a condition very similar to ALS. And there's been a lot of speculation. Terry, what was the name of that fellow?
Gajusek.
Oh, yes, Carlton Gajusek, the Kuru expert.
Speculating about aluminum in the soil and in the water. What's your feeling about that in Alzheimer's?
Not only is it important to understand any disease, but the similarity of the Guam disease to human ALS and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's makes one feel that if one could get a clue about the Guam disease, it might give very powerful insights into all of these other diseases.
Well, do we have an idea of what is involved? Do we know whether the aluminum issue is relevant, or has that been thrown out? Could it be a slow virus?
Well, Gajusek himself, as well as many others, have been to Guam. There have been a succession of eminent investigators. A cycad hypothesis arose in the 1950s, seemed to be disproved in 1970, was resurrected in the 80s. It sort of waxes and wanes. Gajusek himself thought that the disease might be associated with low levels of calcium and magnesium in the water and the inability of the body to couple, to chelate with certain heavy metals, in particular with aluminum and manganese, and a tendency for aluminum to get into the brain. One does know that the tangles of Alzheimer's disease are rich in aluminum, and when this came out some years ago, there was a scare and people started to throw out their saucepans and things. Whether the aluminum is causative or whether it is simply a secondary deposition in a dead cell, I think isn't quite clear. But certainly the mineral hypothesis is a strong and viable one. The notion of an infective agent, and particularly a long-term virus, I think has again been considered and thrown out, and I think needs to be reconsidered. But we don't know what it is.
Let me ask you this. You have many passions. You are, first and foremost, a neurologist, and you care profoundly about your patients and about discovering new things. But you also have demonstrated through your books a passion for botany. And this must have been an extraordinary trip for you to see all these plants and animals.
Yeah, well, in my I was originally at one time hoping to be a botanist or marine biologist or whatever, and then half reluctantly went on to human physiology and human beings, and now I'm sure that was inevitable, but the old interests are there, and of course islands are endlessly fascinating to the biologist. The theory of evolution arose from Darwin visiting the Galapagos and finding quite different species on adjacent islands and seeing how evolution had gone differently on different islands. These oceanic islands, and Pingalap and Guam are oceanic islands, they're not parts of a continent. They've emerged from the ocean floor, from the depths of the sea. They were originally volcanoes. For perhaps millions or tens of millions of years, they were too hot to have any life. Then they started to be settled. But I, both at an aesthetic level, because they were like paradises, and at a biological level, I was entranced by the tropical vegetation and by the unique species on different islands, and specifically with the cycads, at the notion of their travels, which somehow seem to mirror the travels of the Polynesians and the Micronesians, who had left Malaya and Indochina probably 8,000 years ago and found their way across the Pacific. And similarly, the Guam cycad and some of the other Pacific cycads seem to have come from Southeast Asia and to have been borne by ocean currents. And the notion of their travelling. They have these big floating seeds. This sort of fascinated me.
And it seems to me that you had a marvelous opportunity to see all of the rich variety and the differences. And I'd like to circle back to something we were talking about earlier. Conventional wisdom tells us that people with deficits of some kind compensate or learn to compensate. For example, we usually believe that blind people develop an especially strong sense of hearing. What you have to tell us in both of these books, The Island of the Colorblind and An Anthropologist on Mars, is similar to that and yet a little more complicated.
Well, I think this thought is not sufficiently developed in some of my earlier books like Awakenings and Hat. I think when I first encountered the deaf community, I started to see how profound these adaptations could be. Now, one knows, it's always been said anecdotally, that deaf people have unusually keen sight. It's now been shown that the ability to read sign language quickly depends on powers of visual memory, visual parsing, visual analysis, peripheral visual attention, notably greater than normal. This superpower is already apparent in deaf children of 3 as they are learning sign language, and one can demonstrate that in them that what would be the auditory parts of the brain, the auditory cortex, has been reallocated for visual processing, really to form a sort of accessory visual brain. So there's really this remarkable new neurological invention, as it were, a supernumerary visual brain, where culture has actually altered biology in these people. Of course, this is not transmitted. It's not in the genes. Every deaf child has to modify his own brain this way. But one gets some idea of the plasticity of the nervous system, of the profundity of compensation, and of the unexpected potentials in the nervous system, which one might never have guessed at if the person weren't challenged in particular ways. So I found this immensely exciting. I mean, thrilling, stunning. I don't know what word to use. And certainly now looking at the way people survive and thinking not so much in terms of deficits, although I don't deny these and they mustn't be denied, but how people and nervous systems and communities construct or reconstruct nervous systems and lives and worlds in different ways. I mean, this seems to me one of the central excitements. It's the creative centre of neurology and of the nervous system.
You've been listening to Dr. Oliver Sacks. We interviewed him in February 1997 about his book, The Island of the Colorblind. We've rerun it for you today to honor his memory. Dr. Sacks died on August 30th.
Special thanks to Virginia Cassell, who produced the show in 1997, and to David Wright, who engineered the interview.
Thanks also to Russ Henry, who was able to retrieve it from the archive. Al Wodarski is our engineer. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth Extra Care 20 cream, with 20% urea for extra skin protection. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you would like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 162. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can also place the order online at peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our website, you can check out prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. You can also share your thoughts on today's show. Do you have a special memory of Dr. Oliver Sacks? We'd love to hear from you.
On the website, you can also sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show and never miss another People's Pharmacy program. You could share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks very much for listening today, and please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.